Today we have the honor of having Joseph Lewis to talk with us about the Kent State Massacre. Joe was one of the 9 students that was shot and wounded on May 4, 1970. He was actually shot twice by 2 different guardsmen.
Thank you very much, Laurel. I'd like to begin by saying that I don't really consider being shot an accomplishment like you would if you served your country or you raised a family or you were a good friend. It just happened to be a time and a place where I was and a reaction that I had to what was going on around me. And so I have a series of photographs from various sources, who we will give a group of names later. This first one is an aerial view of a portion of the Kent State campus, but this captures the area where most of the activity around the shootings occurred. This is like about 1/8 of the size of the campus at Kent. And in the right center, you'll see Taylor Hall. And above that, you'll see Johnson Hall. Taylor Hall, with the whitish roof, is the School of Architecture and the School of Journalism. And as my friend Jim Russell, who was also shot that day and has since passed away, rest in peace, Jim, as he used to say, you don't want to try to have a cover-up in front of the School of Journalism, because there were dozens of photographers and as a result, hundreds of photographs taken of the activities of that day and that weekend. So what I often say is, you don't have to take my word for the things that I say, but if you look at the photos, they speak for themselves and they let you see the demeanor of the people who are there, both the guardsmen and the students. You can see the numbers, you can see the distances, and as they say in the courtroom, the photos speak for themselves. The next photograph I have is one that my partner Russell liked, but I always thought it was too busy. And it kind of shows the motion of things around the campus. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it because, frankly, I don't like it. I don't think it explains deeply enough what happened. So I'm going to move to the next one. And this is the reason why I'm talking to you about the Kent State shooting today. These 4 students, these 4 young people, former students, were murdered that day at Kent State University. Sandy and Bill, Jeff and Allison. And I know that if my photo was on that page, one of them would be speaking to you in my place as I try to speak for them, so that we don't forget the horrible tragedy that happened that day, or the severe injustice that no one was ever held accountable for that occurred at Kent State's campus on May 4th, 1970. I didn't know any of these 4, but I had acquaintance with Allison as a result of being mailbox partners with her boyfriend, Barry. Barry and I both lived in Johnson Hall, which was in the center of that aerial photograph. And since Barry's last name was Levine and mine was Lewis, we were alphabetically sequential. So we shared a mailbox. And as a result of that, I got to see Barry and Allison a couple of times every week. And Allison was attractive in every way. She was vibrant, she was happy, and she was very active. And I was always very pleased to be able to see her, although I didn't really speak to her except maybe to say hi. And so the story at Kent State started with Nixon's announcement of the incursion of American troops into Cambodia on April 30th, 1970. He called it the Cambodian incursion, and he said it was an attempt to cut off the supply lines to the enemy fighters in the south of Vietnam. Those of us in the peace movement considered it an expansion of the war, and all across the country, people protested against this expansion of the war, of the American war in Vietnam, including at Kent State. There was a protest planned to bury the Constitution because Nixon had killed the Constitution, because, as we've heard many times since, only the Congress can declare war, not the president. And so there was a poorly attended, I have to say, demonstration to bury the Constitution on the Kent State Commons that following day. It was kind of the first weekend of spring-like weather in northeastern Ohio. And so that night, Friday, people headed downtown like they often did. And at freshman orientation, our hostess said that Kent had 28 bars and 5 blocks, which as an 18-year-old has some weight with it when you're talking about things that way. And a lot of the bars had live music. And so in northeastern Ohio, there are many towns within a short hour's drive of Kent, including Akron, Cleveland, Canton. And so people would come from all over to Kent on the weekends to enjoy music and enjoy the scene, the college scene. The college kids were there and it was fun. And so that's what happened Friday night. As usual, on a spring weekend, people came to the bars in Kent to celebrate the weekend. And because of the activities on the campus, there was some people who were upset with the spreading of the war in South Vietnam. And so there were some people on the streets that night who were kind of disrupting the way things normally went. I wasn't there, but my friend Russell was. And when we gave this talk together, he would cover those activities on Friday night because he witnessed them. And I'd like to say that my presentation about Kent State was 100% better when Russell did it with me. But I feel him here with me in spirit today. And he said that there were people who were racing up and down the street, Water Street in Kent. There was like a car and a motorcycle. And there were some people who wanted to have a public demonstration. They started a fire in a 55-gallon drum in the street. And some people gathered round. And the mayor of Kent at the time, Leroy Satram was his name, made a very unwise decision. About 11 o'clock that Friday night, he closed down all the bars, causing the people there to flood out into the streets, which was like a recipe for disaster, if you ask me, a recipe for some kind of unrest to happen. And like I said, I wasn't there, but there is the photograph. The next photograph shows a fire in the street, people kind of milling around, and note the classic cars in the parking lot there from that era, the 1970. And so you can see there's a disruption happened, people on the sides of the streets. Nothing too violent happened, but later that night, some windows were broken at businesses in downtown Kent. And I understand that at that point, the mayor had a conversation with the governor who had some calls that was recorded with the White House. And if you recall, the time Nixon was the president and Governor Rhodes was the governor of Ohio. Governor Rhodes called out the National Guard more than any other governor in the United States. And he was running for office. He was running for the Republican primary for U.S. Senate from Ohio on Tuesday, May the 5th. So that would be just a few days after this Friday night. He wanted to have a law and order showing. He wanted to show how strong he was on enforcing the law. So this is a picture of Friday night in Kent. And I'm sorry, that's all I have of it. Like I said, I wasn't there, and Russell was, and so he would fill in those details when we talked about it. The next photo captures the activity on the campus on Saturday night. And now I was there because this was the ROTC building right across the Commons, which was the grassy area in the first photograph. My dormitory looked right across the Commons to the ROTC building. So when that Saturday night, when I heard a commotion happening outside, I stepped outside my dorm and just stood a distance away and watched as a group of people made several attempts to ignite the ROTC building, which at that time ROTC was considered an arm of the military established on campuses across the country. And so the peace movement, the anti-war folks, considered that a target. And there was a rumor that it was going to be targeted on Kent State campus. I don't remember how I heard it, but I know that I heard something to that effect. And so I watched from the back of the crowd as some people, supposedly students, made an attempt to ignite the building. They threw a lit traffic flare on the roof, and it rolled off and fell to the ground. And then they broke a window and tried to light a drapery in the window of the building, which flamed, the drapes burned up and then went out. And it seemed to me that about that point, the people who were speaking in front of the group said, let's go around the campus and get more supporters. And so I followed along behind as we did just that. And the campus is large. It's like, I don't know, 50 or 60 acres. But we walked around to some of the other dormitories that weren't in the initial photo to try and get more students to join our group. And I followed along behind. We went around the campus to the east and then out to the main street, Route 59, and along the front of the campus. And as we went along the highway, people in the front of the crowd were disturbing traffic by putting up barricades. And I remember they pulled a big air compressor out into the lane so cars would be blocked. And then they proceeded on their way. And then people behind them, assuming to be students as well, moved the stuff out of the highway so that people wouldn't be disrupted on their drive through town. And we looped back around and headed back towards the central part of the campus, which would be eventually to my dormitory. But before we headed back that way, I saw the National Guard arrive in town on Highway 59 coming from the east, from Ravenna, where the armory was. And there were jeeps, there were troop trucks, and there were half-tracks, armored personnel carriers, roaring into town from the east. And when I saw that, I knew it was time to get back to safety. So I headed back towards my dorm and past the ROTC building, which at this point, and I think kind of suspiciously, was fully involved in flames because it wasn't when we left. And so for me, that's always been a question about who actually started the building on fire. And it's a question that's never been adequately answered. And so I got back to my dorm, and my room actually faced the opposite way from the ROTC building. So I went across the hall to my friend Tommy Thompson's room. And I remember we watched out his window, the flames burning. It was just a shocking scene to see this building go up in flames. And there was some ammunition in it that was firing off as the fire burned. And in Cleveland, there was an FM station called WMMS. And, this was, of course, national news, and especially big news in northeastern Ohio. And I don't think it was ironic is the right word, but while this ROTC building was burning, WMMS was playing that Buffalo Springfield song, For What It's Worth. Something's happening here. It's not really clear what it is. And to me, that song will always be connected with the flames burning the ROTC building down. Now, it's my understanding that the building was actually a leftover structure from after the end of World War II. It was a wooden barracks, and it had been previously condemned. But like education funding everywhere, the budget was tight, and so it was pressed into service for housing the ROTC activities. So that night, went to bed. My parents called me, that came out the next day actually to check on me to see that everything was okay, and I told them it was. But the National Guard had arrived in Kent, and there were around 900 of them, I understand, who bivouacked on the practice soccer field just off campus. And the next photo is from Sunday during the day. And it was so bizarre because in spite of what you see here, this is one of the half-tracks I referred to, armored personnel carrier. And Sunday was a sunny day in northeastern Ohio. So there was visiting going on between National Guardsmen and students. And it was surprisingly calm, and there wasn't any portend of wrongdoing or scary things to come. It was just a really weird juxtaposition of the freedom of being a freshman at college and having your campus occupied by Army people, like it seemed like would happen in Vietnam. But the guardsmen didn't mind visiting with the students, particularly with the co-eds, and there were a lot of them around visiting folks. The next picture shows a kind of a famous scene with a trooper with a lilac blossom in the barrel of his gun. And this is when Allison spoke to him and said, "Flowers are better than bullets. What's the matter with peace?" And his commanding officer jumped all over him, ripped the flowers out of his gun, and harangued him for just doing what you see him doing here, standing with the flower in the barrel of his M1 Garand. But you can also see in the other photos the co-eds visiting with guardsmen and talking. And it was, as I said, it was it didn't predict what was going to happen later that night and the following day. Now, the National Guard had not declared martial law, but they had taken command of the campus over from the university, and they had instituted a curfew, which was 10 o'clock in the city and 11 o'clock on the campus. And so that night, when night fell, the National Guard spread out to enforce the curfew rules. And so the next photo shows a couple of National Guardsmen accosting a young man, my good friend Jim Russell. He was a fraternity guy, and he's standing on the lawn of his fraternity house, and these guardsmen are telling him it's past curfew and he better get inside. And he was well aware of his constitutional rights, as we all are and should be, that he was free to be there if he wanted to be, because it was a property that he was paying taxes on, he said, and he wasn't going anywhere. And one of these gentlemen wraps him in the knee with a baton, and he fell to the ground. And as I've said, the governor of Ohio kind of implied that the students were terrorists. He called us the worst people we harbor in America, worse than the Nazis and the brown shirts, at a press conference that afternoon. So that night when they went to enforce this curfew, I have to say that we weren't terrorists, we weren't bad people, we were just kind of smart asses. Jim and I would include us both in that category. When they told Jim, I guess you'll move now, after they smacked him in the knee and he fell to the ground in pain, he struggled back up and he said, I'm not going anywhere unless you hit me in the other knee, then I'll just fall to the ground. And I'm sure they didn't like that. But I also point out that he's got the appropriate fashion for demonstration with the headband and an army jacket. I guess I had an army jacket too. But we weren't terrorists, we were smartasses. And we weren't ready for what was going to happen. That night, Sunday night, was the most frightening experience of the whole weekend, because as I was in my dormitory, out over the commons, there were 3 helicopters. I know one was the state police, and 2 of them may have been Army National Guard helicopters. I wasn't sure. But they had big searchlights playing down on the ground, and there were clouds of tear gas where the guardsmen had tried to break up groups of students that gathered, because their rule was that they would not allow 4 or more people to gather together on the campus. And so groups of guardsmen with fixed bayonets on their rifles were herding students out of the commons area, and so they fled everywhere they could to get out of harm's way. And I spoke later that night with my resident counselor, Lou Jeffries, and he was at the door of Johnson Hall, which, if you remember from the photo, there was a first floor door entryway right from the hill coming up from the commons. And so Lou was telling students to come in and get out of harm's way. And if they needed to, they could travel down the end of the building and out the other side and go to wherever their dorm was. And Lou told me the story that night about how, as the guardsmen were herding students at bayonet point, that he pulled this last student in, who was in the line of students, and pulled the door shut with the panic bar. And right behind the student was a guardsman who lunged with his bayonet so that the bayonet got stuck in the doorway when Lou pulled it shut. And our conversation late that night in the dorm was whether these guns would be loaded, whether they would have blanks. And I remember saying, it's hard to tell who's wearing the white hats and who's wearing the black hats, because as we watched these activities on Sunday night, I actually saw guardsmen throwing rocks at the windows of the dormitory at Kent State, and students, yelling at them from the windows. So it was kind of confusing, and the determination that I had was there was really no need for them to have live ammunition or loaded weapons, because there was no threat to their safety on the campus. I wasn't a gun person. I wasn't a hunter. I didn't have gun training, which, the first rule of having a weapon is that you will always assume it's loaded. And I didn't have that training, so I didn't think that.
Can I interject? How old were you, Joe?
Oh, I was 18. I was a freshman at Kent State. I was 18 just that summer. The 4 students who were killed were 19 and 20. So we were all pretty young and naive. And like I said before in my presentation to the Kiwanis, I was even goofier than I am now. So that should tell you something. Let's see the next picture. Oh, so the next picture is Monday. There was a rumor that there was going to be an assembly on Monday morning, and the catch was this, that the university was open as usual for classes. And I had worked all through high school to save my money to be able to afford 1 year at Kent State. And so classes were being held as usual, but the National Guard was still present there in big numbers. And they were not going to allow groups of 4 or more to gather on the campus. So we had this unbelievably impossible situation where groups of students were trying to go to class and the guardsmen would not let groups congregate. So in the face of that, I decided to lend my presence, my body, if you would, to join the group of students who were assembling to protest that. And so my support was to join with the other students. And this is a picture of the Victory Bell, which would be to celebrate sports victories, which were uncommon in those days, although they do have a pretty good basketball team now. They just got eliminated from the MAC tournament, I think, a night or two ago. But this is the Victory Bell on the edge of the Commons, and you can see the students gathering on the hillside behind. And in fact, there's one person who I know in this photo, and she's right at the fulcrum of the bell. There's a dark-haired woman. Her name's Margaret. She was a good friend of mine. Well, she was a good friend of mine after what she said to me. She was still a good friend of mine. She said I was a pseudo-intellectual, which I think I was, probably. But she was one of the reasons I was determined to attend this assembly, because she was at a Sunday night gathering, and so was Jim Russell. Sunday night, in defiance of the curfew, a group of students left the campus and went onto the street in front campus, where they wanted to speak with the mayor and the president of the university. They were told that if they sat down peacefully, that they would get the mayor and the president to come and speak with them, even though that was impossible because the president was actually out of town. Mm-hmm. And actually, they had no intention of doing that. But they sat down peaceably. I think they probably sang a few songs, and they waited. But around them, the National Guard surrounded them on the far side. And the minute the curfew went into effect, which would have been 10 o'clock on the street, the National Guard started hurting them with tear gas and fixed bayonets and chased them onto the campus. The prelude to what I saw from my dorm window and Lou Jeffries saving those people from being stabbed as they ran away from the guardsmen. And I saw Margaret later that night, the person in this photo. She was a tough woman. She was outspoken, as you can tell by my comments about her, but she was also strong. And when I saw her, she was trembling and crying and saying, they lied to us, because while they sat in the street waiting to speak, they hustled them off at bayonet point and chased them back onto the campus. So she was really shook up that Sunday night. So this is Monday, the gathering on the Commons begins, and I actually went to class with a girlfriend of mine, sociology class, and it seemed like there were two messages that day. One was, it's a participatory democracy, and if you want to hear your voice heard, you need to act on it. And the other one was, run for your life and hide because there's danger about. And if you notice during that day, there were very few African American students about because they were aware of what had happened in the past with law enforcement and assemblies of Black people. So very few African American people attended these assemblies. So the next picture is another one of the crowd, and it's included to show that the disposition of the crowd. They're just gathering their students. Very few of them have anything in their hands. There's a couple of people who have flags, including Alan, who had a black flag because a neighbor of his from Barberton, Ohio, had been killed in Vietnam just 2 weeks before. But I'm actually in this photo. I'm about 1/3 of the way in from the left. I have a pixie cut, I guess you'd call it. And the person in front of me has their arm up, so that when I did a deposition with the lawyers for the state, they said, aren't you holding a flag? I said, no, I'm not. I don't have my arm up, but they spotted me in this picture. In fact, when we took our depositions, they had all the photos that could have had us in them, and they had them all marked up and ready to ask us about. But this shows the group of students. This is just to the left as you look at the Victory Bell. And across the commons from us was the line of guardsmen who were protecting the ashes of the ROTC building, apparently. And they were all, fixed bayonets, tear gas masks, steel helmets, and then there was the commons, the wide commons, like as big as a soccer field between us and the students on this side, where I also assembled and watched to see what would happen. There was some chanting going on, which I didn't participate in. 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't want your effing war. I wanted to act on my own behalf. I wasn't trying to be part of the crowd, and I don't know. That's just how I felt at the time. The next photo shows again the crowd of students. No weapons. No screaming, no bottles, no bricks, none of that was present at all. This just is intended to show the students' response to the guardsmen. There is a person with a headband, it may be Jeff Miller, and it looks like he may have his arm up, a middle finger extended, which was in evidence a few times that day. And so while the guardsmen were across the field, at one point they sent a Jeep out with a man with a bullhorn in it, the next photo. And the person in the bullhorn, I'll never forget, he said 3 times, apparently is the magic number to make an illegal announcement. He said, "Students of Kent State, this is an illegal assembly. Return to your dormitories." And of course, since we were smartasses, there was a big scream went up and probably a whole bunch of middle fingers upraised. And in fact, I saw something hit the wheel of the Jeep. I don't know if it was a rock or what, but it was the only time I saw anything at that time hit the Jeep, but it hit the wheel. You can see, again, the demeanor of the students. These guardsmen made that announcement. Then they went, and we didn't leave. So at that point, they had a cadre of guardsmen, about 9 of them, step forward with modified grenade launchers to shoot tear gas canisters. And it's still, I have to say that, as twisted as I was at the time, maybe, it didn't seem threatening. It didn't seem like a portentous time for evil things or terrible things to happen. It seemed like a macabre tennis match where the guardsmen would fire tear gas across that grassy space between the guardsmen's line and the students. And then some students would cover their faces with a cloth, pick up the non-hot end of the tear gas canister and throw it back. So it was like this weird tennis match. Whenever guardsmen would shoot a tear gas canister towards us, the crowd would boo. And when the student would run up and throw it back, the crowd would cheer. Very bizarre, I have to tell you. But at some point, when the crowd refused to leave, and we stayed, where we were paying to attend with classes as usual, the guardsmen moved out, and the line of guardsmen crossed the commons, approaching the students. And I was, in front of that. This is the backside of Taylor Hall, actually. I was in that crowd somewhere. When the guardsmen approached, of course, we got out of their way. And I went from this photo, the right side of Taylor Hall. And just beyond that was Johnson Hall, where I live. So I took to the right side of Taylor Hall and marched up over the hill in front of the guardsmen, who proceeded to continue up. This is the right side of that hill, the right side of Taylor Hall. Let's go to the next photo. And this shows some tear gas hitting the ground and escaping. But it has my good friend, my dear brother, Jim Russell, in this photo. He's in the left 1/3, just above the middle helmet of the guardsman. And he's got sunglasses on, and he's gazing up at watching the tear gas fly. And he was a remarkable person, a very good friend of mine. I didn't know him beforehand. We got to be very close afterwards, after the shooting. And when Jim got shot and they took him to the hospital, in his pants pockets, he had a couple of extinguished tear gas canisters. And when the FBI interviewed him, they asked him what was his intention with taking those tear gas canisters. And he was an art major. And Jim said he was going to make a mobile with them. Just the kind of twisted sense of humor he had. But this is the hillside, as I said, to the right of Taylor Hall, between Taylor and Johnson Hall, which was where I lived. And this is the path that I took ahead of the guardsmen as they pushed forward and forced us off the commons. And you see many other people did the same thing, took the same path. And so the guardsmen marched up that hill to the corner of Taylor Hall. So this is after the guardsmen climbed that hill, and down the other side, they crossed this service road that you see kind of cutting this photo in half. There's a service road there. They crossed that service road down to what's called the practice football field. So the guardsmen assembled down the practice football field, and the body of students, including myself, parted, let the guardsmen pass through up the hill and down the other side into the practice football field. And then the group of students coalesced so that we were watching them from slightly above on the hillside in front of Taylor Hall and behind Johnson Hall. And we watched them go down there. I should point out the practice football field is surrounded by a fence on two sides. So the far side, there's a long fence, and then the very back, there's a fence. And so the guardsmen got down there and again took out their bullhorn, and they said, "Students of Kent State, we have you surrounded." Now, there were other guardsmen that we didn't see in the picture, but it seemed ridiculous because as you looked at this, it seemed like it was the other way around, that the guardsmen were actually surrounded by students, more or less. And so there was kind of a chuckle that rose out of the crowd of students at that time because it was so absurd, the things that they were saying. And so from this position, there were people at the far end, the left side of the practice football field, including Alan Canfora with his flag. Let's go to the next photo. And that shows Alan with his black flag memorializing his Barberton classmate who had been killed in Vietnam. And at this point, the guardsmen were getting harassed by Alan, so they say, but there were also people behind him who were yelling a lot of things at him in the parking lot. So there was a very vocal situation there where the guardsmen took this stance. As you see, they knelt down and aimed their rifles at Alan and the vocal people behind him. I don't know what the message was. Are they going to shoot? You know, what is the hell is going on here? And so there was a standoff like this for a little while. And in the far back of this photo, you can see there's a cluster of men. The General Canterbury was at the scene, one of the National Guard generals, and other officers, and they gathered in the back, and they had some kind of, we call it the huddle, and no one knows what was said at that point. I suspect it was, let's show these rascals, let's teach these rascals a lesson or something like that, something mean-spirited. Lock and load was when they first left the Commons area. That lock and load decision, which was shocking, so shocking. They did that before they ever tear gassed the students at the very beginning of the demonstration. Yeah, they were passing the ammo out before the guardsmen actually flushed the students off the Commons and up and over the hill. It was early on.
This is the Guard's commanding general, Robert Canterbury. He has only recently arrived and is still wearing his business suit.
You have your weapons in the ready position.
The troops are told to load live ammunition. This is out of the ordinary. Most of the time, soldiers wear their ammunition clips on their uniform, which constitutes a clear show of force.
Yeah, that was early on, even before they flushed students up over the hill.
I'd like to add that General Canterbury, he's wearing a suit or a sports jacket, and he's not in uniform. And the rules related to a commander giving an order to shoot or anything, if they're not in uniform, it doesn't count. So he was very specifically there wearing average gear, not in uniform, so that he would never be charged with giving an order to fire.
Mm.
Oh my God.
Mm.
Wow. Okay, continue, Joe.
Okay, so there's this standoff where these kneeling guardsmen are aiming at Alan and the vocal people behind him for a while, and then this group got together and whatever they said, and at that point, they got up, and let's go to the next picture. This is what they saw when they looked back towards Taylor Hall. Many students gathered, and I think Russell's there, and I was somewhere around there. But when guardsmen got up to leave the practice football field, they were retracing their steps back the way they had come. At this photo, it would be the left side of Taylor Hall, just the way they had come. And so as they headed that way, kind of a cry of victory went up from the students, because it was like, we won, they're leaving us alone. Let's go to the next photo. So this shows the guardsmen, climbing the hill back the way they had come, towards the gap between Taylor Hall and Johnson Hall. And I was very near to them when they came this way. In fact, I had to move again out of their way because they were coming directly towards me. And so I could hear the jostling of their equipment, and I could see them. And if you could see it a little more clearly, these men are looking sharply over their right shoulders back at the Prentice Hall parking lot and the area where Alan had been and the other vocal students who were really giving them a hard time. And I have always thought that some of them at this point, and I think ultimately there were 8 guardsmen who our analysis suggested shot into this crowd of students. And so that's about how many were on this end. And I suspect that maybe they were picking out their targets here at this point, because there's just a group at the end with all of them turning this way. And so I moved out of their way because I had been in the area, in that gap between the buildings, Johnson and Taylor. And so I moved towards Taylor Hall onto the sidewalk in front of Taylor Hall. Let's go to the next photo here. So this shows another shot of them They've crossed the service road now, and they're heading up the hill. The strategic location for them would be at the top of that hill. And that's where they're heading. And I never really thought that through until much later, that the strategic position for them would be at the hilltop. So here they are heading across the service road and about to climb the hill up towards Taylor Hall. And I am somewhere in front of them, moving quickly to the right of this photo to be in front of Taylor Hall rather than in that space where they were going to come. So the next photo shows the guardsmen at the pagoda. As I said, Taylor Hall was the home of the School of Architecture as well as journalism on Kent State's campus. So you can see the cluster of guardsmen coming up the hill, and in the right third of the picture, you see a person with actually it's me. I'm directly below the corner of the sign for Taylor Hall, facing the guardsmen. My hair is kind of flipped back. The page boy haircut that I was sporting at the time. So the guardsmen, I'm watching them and seeing them look back over their shoulders, and I watch them walk past, and you can now see this is the time. This is just probably 30 seconds before the shooting. And so this is one of the important photographs that demonstrates what the students were doing while the guardsmen were reaching their strategic position at the top of the hill. Now, you notice the students all got books. Most of them got books in their hands. You don't see any weapons. You don't see any attacking a surge, or nobody's running towards them. And so this is a few seconds before they got, let's go to the next photo. And this is a photo by photographer Paul Topol, who, may he rest in peace, captured me at my most foolish moment, because I didn't get the cue from the people behind me to run for your friggin' life. When they aimed their rifles at me, the guardsmen, who you can see in the right corner of the picture, they aimed their rifles at me, and I was thinking about the standoff that had just happened on the practice football field. I was prepared for street theater, but they were prepared for battle. So they aimed their rifles at me. I'm giving them the finger here. And within a second or two, I was shot. The bullet entered my body at my belt level, just inside of my right hip, in a small hole the size of a quarter. And it exited my body in my left hip, about where my jeans pocket would be, in a hole the size of a Coke can. It knocked me back to the ground, and I fell on the ground. And the firing lasted for 13 seconds, which when Jim and I would do our classroom presentations, we would stop and watch the clock for 13 seconds. And so let's count off the period of time that the gunfire continued. 1001, 1002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. The gunfire stopped. About 67 rounds were fired. When the gunfire stopped, there was this eerie, dead silent moment. And then all kinds of screaming broke out and craziness. And I was on the ground. The guardsmen backed off. They didn't offer any medical assistance. I was on the ground, and some person came up to me from my left, took out my wallet, and saw that I was a high school classmate of his younger sister. And I asked him, I couldn't get up, and I had a very bloody wound on my left hip. I asked him, how bad is it? And he totally lied and said, well, he couldn't tell, really. He said, I think it's just a flesh wound. And so I was greatly relieved, but I relaxed back down. And as time went by, I started to feel weak. And then when you're 18, you don't have a good grasp of mortality, really. I said to myself, this could be it. I thought I might die. But I have to say, for anyone watching, that I really wasn't afraid. I mean, I was 18. I hadn't accumulated a whole lot of bad behaviors yet. So I wasn't afraid to die. But from my other side, from my right side, a young woman came over and held my hand. And I squeezed her hand until my knuckles turned white. And she comforted me. And years later, I met her and found her. She's in the Northwest, too. I met her, and probably about 5 years ago, we met at Kent State again for the first time since this day. And it was very, very touching, I'll tell you. Her name is Ellen, and I thank her for giving me that comfort that day. And what I didn't realize until later in our 75 civil trial was that not only was I shot through the abdomen, but another guardsman testified in court that he shot someone who was already shot writhing on the ground. And that bullet went through the bones of my lower left leg just above my ankle, but it missed both of the bones. So I want to tell you I'm lucky in a lot of ways to be here talking with you today. And I only wish that those other 4 students had had my luck that day. And when they asked this guardsman, why did he shoot somebody who was already shot, he said very flippantly, he said, well, everybody else was shooting him. And I just thought that was a horrible, horrible statement for a human being to make about shooting another human being. But so I'm on the ground, students gather around me. Let's go to the next photo. This is a photo of the guardsmen. Actually, looks like they're shooting. And what's so telling about this photograph is, these guys, they lied. They said they were afraid for their lives. The photographs don't support that. And then there's the guy on the far left side of this. He's a left-hander, and he's squatting down. He's got a .45 caliber pistol. This is Sergeant Pryor. Before he realized there were photographs, he said he never fired this .45, but there's enough photographic evidence to show that he fired it at least 3 times. And the reason that the analysts knew this is, and I didn't know this before, like I said, I didn't know guns, but a .45 caliber pistol, apparently each time it discharges, the slide slides back and exposes the round barrel at the tip as another round is chambered. And so each time it's fired, the barrel is exposed, the barrel is exposed, the barrel is exposed. And so there's 3 photos of Sergeant Pryor's .45 caliber pistol being discharged when at first he said that he'd never fired it.
Wow.
There was complete confusion about who fired and which gun they had, and that was intentional. The normal military procedure is that guns by serial number and rounds were specifically assigned to individuals and then accounted for after something would happen. That didn't happen at Kent State. So there was no accountability about who fired. It was based on what they testified. And the guardsmen got together for 30 days. They were sequestered at the armory, and none of them were available for press comment or information. And when they came out after 30 days, it was all like they'd all been hypnotized. They all said, we fired because we were afraid for our lives. And the guy who shot me Now, people ask me, did you ever talk to him? And he's since passed away, which I don't celebrate because I never got to talk to him and have him admit that what he said wasn't true, that he was not afraid for his life, that I was standing still silently. I was, in fact, giving him the finger. He claimed he could see my right hand, but he couldn't see my left hand and thought I might have a weapon. That's what he claimed, but that's ridiculous. So I'm on the ground and I'm shot, and these people have come to give me assistance. The guardsmen left.
They just left everyone bleeding there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. They just turned on their heels and marched away, even though they had medics present with them. After a while, the ambulance came, and I got loaded into an ambulance with John Cleary, and John had been shot in the lungs. And between the two of us, we were in a lot of pain in that ambulance going to the Robinson Memorial Hospital in Ravenna. And it's really weird. I think that the shock that your body goes into is quite amazing because I never lost consciousness until we got to the emergency doors at the Robinson Memorial. And I remember the corpsman or whoever it was, that nurse that met me at the door, told me, "We're going to have to cut off your clothes." And I was such a good boy. I remember thinking, Mom's not going to like that. And that's the last memory I have for several days after getting in the hospital and fighting an infection and basically fighting for our lives for the first 48 hours or so. On my right-hand side in intensive care was Dean Kaler. And on my left-hand side was John Cleary. And I am or was 6'3", and I was the shortest of the three of us. Dean was like 6'5", and John was 6'6" or 6'7". So all of our feet stuck out the end of the beds of the ICU, I remember. And our parents bonded over this tragedy, but it was like, I don't know, you had to find some comedy in it. And one other thing I want to say that was just a very special moment was I talked to Dean afterwards. We roomed together in another room afterwards. But Dean told me that when we were in intensive care, fighting for our lives, basically 50-50 living and dying, that he opened his eyes for a minute. And one of my aunts, my mom's sister, Joan, was a nun. So Dean said, and Dean's from the Church of the Brethren, very peaceful people. He said he opened his eyes, and all around my bed were like half a dozen nuns praying for me. And he thought, oh my God, I'm in heaven and it's Catholic. I'm screwed. Oh man, and he I can't say enough about him. He is a kind person and kind of a mentor to mine. I treat him like I feel like he's my big brother and helps me through a lot of things.
Can you share what Dean's injuries were?
Dean, when the gunfire happened, I usually have my book with me and I read the distances for people. So first of all, let me tell you about the four students who were killed. I was 70 feet away. Jeff Miller was 270 feet away. And I'm sure he was yelling because he was shot in the mouth and it killed him instantly. Allison was 340 feet away, and I believe she and Barry were hiding behind a car. Bill Schroeder, who was an ROTC cadet, he and Sandy were 390 feet away. Bill was prone on the ground because he heard the gunfire. He took cover. And Sandy was carrying books in her arms when she was shot and killed. Now, Dean, I'm not sure of his distance, but it was similar to theirs. And he was an East Canton boy. He was a hunter. He knew about guns, and he knew that there was danger afoot. So he was prone on the ground when the bullet severed his spinal cord and paralyzed him for life from about the waist down. And he's had multiple health challenges since then, of course. So I spent 3 weeks of the day in the hospital. And when I got out to my family home in Massillon, Ohio, the local paper came out with a story about the Kent State shootings, which I was very curious to see how they covered it, because I knew that's what my neighbors would see. And unfortunately, it lied. The article said that students had attacked guardsmen with bricks and bats, bottles, and overturned cars. Not a word of that was true. Not one word of that was true. And so I kind of laid low and was very cautious. I did call into one talk show once, but it was not a good experience. And oh, by the way, my parents went to find me in the hospital after they heard my name on the radio being shot. And so my little sister, who was 16, stayed home with the 4 other kids. And she was there when someone called on the phone and said, "Is this the Lewis residence?" was Joseph Lewis shot at Kent State, and I hope he dies. Just a hateful thing that a 16-year-old girl should never have had to hear. So the next photo shows the guardsman shooting, and the next photo shows people taking cover. And then this next one, this is me on the ground. On the right is the girl standing with her hands in her pockets, and there's a gentleman walking in a white shirt. And that's one of my friends who I have not seen since that day. His name is Ron Steele. And I've seen other photos of this moment. He walks up, he looks down, he sees me, and he throws his arms up in the air. And I just want to let him know that I'm okay, because I haven't seen or talked to him since, and I've tried to get a hold of him, but I haven't. So let's go to the next one. And this is the famous, this is either the exact photo or one right before or after the Pulitzer Prize winning photograph that John Philo took of Mary Vecchio, who was a high school student from Florida, screaming over the body of Jeff Miller as his blood runs down the road. And, oh man, it had a tough effect on Mary. And I'd like to add that I've said many times that you didn't have to be shot to be wounded at Kent State. You didn't even have to be there if you knew about it, if your family was there. The wounds are long lasting. And I've had many conversations with people, old people like myself in their 70s. Some of them come to the commemoration and they haven't come for a long time, or they might say, I've never been here since that day. And you can tell they're just so upset they just cry.
There was so much lost, and it was injury and bullets, but it was also the energy of the students before the killing,
Yes.
before the massacre. That was also
well, this is the spring after Woodstock, so it had taken a real turn from the spirit of music and love. And now you see the next photo shows students surrounding a downed, wounded student because the guardsmen didn't supply any help. And then we see a couple of there's a student being wheeled to the ambulance. I don't know who. And let's go to the next one. And this is geology professor Glenn Frank with the flat top and the tie. He was a peace marshal. He was a faculty member, and he was a peace marshal that day. And he prevented more tragedy from happening. His talk was actually recorded and distributed with the yearbook that year on a little vinyl record that you could play and hear him haranguing the students, because the students, when they saw this happen, some of them refused to leave. They sat down, and the guard commander came to Dr. Frank and said, get these students out of here or we're going to force them to leave, however we have to. And so he had a college-age son, and so he just was beside himself with emotion. And he said, I don't care if you've never listened to anybody before in your life, listen to me now. If you don't leave, it can only be a bloodbath, because this guardsman commander had threatened them with more violence. And so he has this very fervent plea, and I hate to even quote him because it upsets me so much, the things he had to say to those students, to say, I don't care if you've never listened to anybody else in your life, for God's sake, you have to leave now. And some did and some didn't. Some stayed and got arrested. And I think the last photo is, for years, the university refused to acknowledge the tragedy that happened there. That after many, many, many years, they finally marked the places where the 4 students fell with these lighted candles so that cars didn't park there anymore, and they were considered sacred ground. And now the university has changed its stance somewhat, and it's been acknowledged as a place of historical importance by the state of Ohio and I think the federal government. So that's the last photo I think I have. And of course, there were many legal follow-ups to the shooting, including FBI investigations, the Nixon Presidential Commission on Campus Unrest, the county grand jury that fall, where the local prosecutor had us come and testify, and being 18 and idealistic, I was talking all about my constitutional rights and my freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And even though I got shot twice, I got arrested as a result of my testimony about the freedoms that I expected to have at college. And 25 people got indicted by the Portage County grand jury, and they were all professors who had talked about civil unrest, maybe Molotov cocktails, or mostly they were students. None of the guardsmen got indicted for any crime. And so we were for years awaiting trial, and they tried to start a few trials, and they had so little evidence that an appeals court judge later ruled that those were unlawful, and in fact ordered the document to be burned in the courthouse parking lot, which it subsequently was. And so those charges were dropped.
That was the Portage County grand
Grand
jury.
jury, yes.
It was ordered burned because it had so many lies in it. They didn't want anyone to have a copy of the lies.
Yeah.
So it's gone. There's no chance there's a
Oh,
a copy anywhere.
of course there's a copy somewhere.
Somewhere. Okay, nothing we can get.
It was what they created, and it was so full of lies. That's the issue. That's what is the important point here. It's like their reports were counterfactual in every possible way.
That enraged Arthur Krause, whose little girl had been murdered. He was an example of strength, of anger, and of justice to us all. We united behind Arthur and Reverend John Adams. He was the church, United Methodist Church Board of Church and Society. And he was stationed in Washington, D.C., but he came like a chaplain to our group. And he also was the only non-Indian to cross the line at Wounded Knee in 1975. During our civil trial, while he was supporting us, he traveled to Wounded Knee to support the American Indian Movement members there. They were remarkable men. And Peter Davies wrote a book it's called The Truth About Kent State. And he gave up his insurance practice in Staten Island. He was outraged too. And so between Arthur and Reverend John Adams, we organized and became what I now call the Kent State families. They were the families of the 4 kids killed. And there's Peter Davies' book that Laurel has. Yeah, the families of the 4 kids killed and the families and the survivors of the 9 of us that were wounded became very, very tight-knit over time. And we went through one after another, legal proceedings. And at first, everything, I have to say, everything about the Kent State shootings was pretty controversial. Like, for instance, do we want to have a trial like the Chicago 7, Chicago 8? Or do we want to have a trial trying to fix a wrong by do we want a political trial? Or do we want a civil damages trial? And so we had lots of discussions. In fact, we wound up with about 8 lawyers working for us. The ACLU worked for us, and a couple of the families had their own lawyers that they had contacted. But of course, we didn't have the wherewithal to pay for this. So the lead fundraiser for the Playboy Foundation, of all things, donated their time and put out requests for assistance all over the United States. And they got $750,000, which in 1975, that's a lot of money. And that's what it costs for us to go forward with our legal challenges. Unfortunately, the first place that we got into a courtroom was the result of the federal grand jury. And that was, I had some suspicion about who burned the building down. I was wondering if the government COINTELPRO had something to do with it. So it was very curious that the first attorneys who represented us were the Justice Department lawyers in the federal grand jury, because they indicted the 8 men who analysis suggests were the ones who shot into the crowd, the 8 National Guardsmen. They were indicted for conspiracy to deprive us of our civil rights. Well, conspiracy is the hardest thing to prove because you have to show that they talked among themselves ahead of time, so they have to be honest, and they weren't. And the judge The judge was also very biased because he had some acquaintance with the politicos and the governor at the time, I believe. And so after the Justice Department presented most of their case, the defendant's attorneys filed for quick dismissal of the case, and the judge agreed because he said they hadn't presented enough facts. The Justice Department attorneys told us that they were saving some facts for rebuttal, which to me just smacks of wrongdoing all the way, and so those charges were dismissed. So then we tried to go to sue in civil court the perpetrators of the violence, the 8 guardsmen, the governor, and the president of the university, who did not protect the students, us there. And during that legal struggle, we had to go from the very local courts to the appeals court, losing each time. We went to the Ohio Supreme Court and we lost, and we appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And the state officials, including the guardsmen, were protected from suit because in those days it was not legally possible to hold them accountable. And it was based on the divine right of kings, where the agents of the state got their power directly from God. And so our attorneys in the U.S. Supreme Court, and me and Dean and a bunch of the other folks attended, it was very, very impressive, very hush-hush. Really had to behave yourself and dress appropriately. And we got that overturned so that we could proceed with a lawsuit. It's not a criminal trial. It's not going to find anyone guilty of murder or attempted murder. But at least we hoped that it would bring out the facts of the case and that we would get a good hearing before a fair jury and see wwhere that led us.
My father led the trials and all the cases, and especially the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was related to Ohio claiming that they were sovereign, and by being sovereign, they were above the law.
Right.
And there are many. At that time, there were a number of states in the Union, the United States, that were also claiming that they were sovereign and above the law. And that meant that you can't sue the governor, you can't sue the state military, you can't sue state even
the police.
Right, because they're above the law and they're in that state. And so we won by unanimous consent at the Supreme Court, and that meant that it was overturned for all the states. So in the United States, there are no longer any states that are sovereign. But this was very hard for us, people seeking truth and justice at Kent State, because it only meant that we had to start all over again. And it's 5 years later. Mm-hmm. And so that's what happened. And this time we were allowed to sue them.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize strongly enough the powerful speeches that Arthur Krause gave in support of our movement, in support of our quest for justice. Because not only was he strong and smart, he was angry. He was so angry. And he demonstrated what it's like to be a good father, maybe, and a strong leader, because we relied on him and his strength and his leadership, along with, as I say, Reverend John Adams, to coordinate us and keep us together while the lawyers were doing their lawyers stuff and their legal language. Arthur was the force that was the spearhead of our movement for justice, and I've always honored his effort and always will.
And I'd also like to interject that my family and my father's activities have been erased from the story of Kent State. The people know what happened that are still alive today. But if you take a look at the history, if you take a look at any of the writings about it, if you take a look at the way that the narrative has been perfected by the national security state, players like my father that really made a difference and was trouble for them have been erased from the story completely.
I also remember a time he was so mad that he said Nixon called student protesters bums, and my daughter was not a bum.
In the violence that day, 4 Kent State students were killed. 2 were girls. The father of 19-year-old Allison Krause of Pittsburgh reacted emotionally to the news of his daughter's death.
She resented being called a bum She felt that war in Cambodia was wrong. Is this dissent a crime? Is this a reason for killing her? I want something to be done.
They're talking about identifying students who are a threat to national security, and that's a broad brush to paint any protester with. During the Kent State trial, we weren't constitutional lawyers, but we knew we had a right to free speech and a right to assemble, a right to redress grievances and disagree with laws that were passed. And in our trial, the state of Ohio's lawyers tried to mock us, to say that you're not a constitutional lawyer. And I remember Russell was on the stand, and Bert Fulton, the Silver Fox, we nicknamed him, he would shake his hand, he'd shake his head to preview your answer, he thought. He said, Mr. Russell, you're not a constitutional lawyer, are you? Well, like I said, Russell was a smart ass. So he started with the preamble, and he recited the whole Constitution. And when he got down to the Bill of Rights, the lawyer said, okay, because, we knew we were within our constitutional rights, and Russell was smart enough to read it, to recite it to him. But, they denied that we had a right to assemble or a right to free speech, and they tried to stop us by killing us and shooting us.
You guys believed in a different world was being born.
Remember, the words that were being used then were counterculture, an alternative kind of approach to society. I mean, before getting shot that spring, I have to confess, I skipped school and hitchhiked all around the East Coast with a buddy of mine, Andy. And you could hitchhike in those days. People would pick you up. Our hair was just a little bit long, and so that was like an identifier. They're cool. Let's pick them up. And so we traveled, to Georgia. We hitchhiked to Georgia, up to New York State, around Ohio, and it was like a new world was coming around the corner that was much more compassionate and forgiving and accepting. And I think that scared the previous generation. They call themselves the greatest generation, but I think that they were kind of closed-minded about accepting people who don't look or speak or agree with them. And so it was kind of the death of 3 days of peace and music and love at Woodstock, happened at Kent State that day.
And everyone, from what I remember, really believed in the possibility for change and for peace.
Yeah.
And peace was something that was attainable, and we were all working together for it and all coming together for it. And I believe that the government took a look at that and they said, we must stop this.
Yeah.
So they came up with Kent State and Jackson State.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Jackson State, because at our commemorations at Kent State, we always include a memory of the Jackson State shootings that happened 10 days later, where 2 young men were killed. But I just recently read
12 were wounded.
12 were wounded. I recently read that I think there were 67 shots approximately fired at Kent State, but I saw the number of shots that happened at Jackson State, and it was like hundreds and hundreds of shots were fired. And I understand that the building that was behind the place where people were shot is still riddled with bullet holes in the brick.
It was a woman's dormitory.
So that's what it was. Yeah.
Still riddled. I mean,
yeah.
Who thinks if you're having a military action, you're going to shoot at a dormitory for kids?
Yeah.
It's a wound that continues to fester. It's 55 years later, folks, and it's still festering. There's still not a credible investigation that's ever been done into Kent State.
We all could benefit from a little Arthur now, that's for sure. I take every opportunity to tell the truth about what happened at Kent State.
When you do these presentations, does it help you heal?
Russell and I started doing them after the Oregon newspaper heard about us in 1995, so the 25th anniversary. We were on the front page of the Oregonian, And then teachers from colleges and high schools started to invite us to come speak. And, that's really daunting. I have stage fright really bad. And it's really daunting to go over such emotional material. But we found exactly that it was very healing for us to go through and talk about it. Even though it's very upsetting thinking about it ahead of time, it was very cathartic to share the pain and the sorrow and the upset feelings with students who are very impressed. And especially high school kids. I mean, maybe they're 17, 18 like I was when I was shot. And when we leave the classroom, there were a lot of tears. A lot of people were really moved by it. And while that's not like maybe a thing you embrace, it was a sign that we were effective in communicating the horror that we were talking about. It was at Wilsonville High School in Oregon is where we went. We had a very sympathetic teacher there. He invited us. Actually, he invited me twice a year, me and Russell. And he talked about one of his students went on to the University of Oregon, and they briefly touched on the Kent State shootings there, where they say, there were student demonstrations and not 4 were killed and 9 were wounded, and kind of like implied that the students had it coming. And she stood up and said, no. I had a guy come to my class and he told us the truth about what happened, and you're not getting it right. And so he always reminded me that, when you do these things, that there are implications beyond what you can imagine and influences that you can't measure that happen. I think it's important to refer people to the church committee. Was it the church committee or church commission?
Church commission.
That talked about COINTELPRO and the FBI operatives and how they targeted dissident groups, including, first of all, the Black Panthers, who scared the shit out of them because they had guns, the American Indian movement, and what they called the New Left, which was the peace movement. And I think they infiltrated all of them.